Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'd like to welcome you all to Ask the ARC. My name is Carly Sciortino-Poulter, and I'm the director of the ARC Advocacy Network here at the ARC of Indiana. And over the last few months, especially, we've talked to a lot of people who are frustrated with all of the changes that are occurring. Or we talk to people who are scared about the changes that are occurring, and people who, frankly, are angry. But we also talk to a lot of people who have some really great ideas about ways that we can make life better for people with disabilities. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. When you want to make change, when you want to make life better, how do you talk to those decision makers to try to make that change? So that is what we're going to discuss tonight in the Ask the ARC. As always, we are recording tonight's episode, so we will be posting it to our YouTube channel as quickly as we can. So if you've got some questions or you've got some personal information, just keep that in mind so that you're making sure everything is okay. And let's go ahead and get started for tonight. So, when we are talking about how we actually want to influence things, we want to make change, we need to talk to our decision makers. But before we can do that, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to identify what it is that we actually want. Because knowing what you want guides who you talk with and then how you proceed from there. So, as you're thinking about things, as you want to make change in this world, what is it that's most important to you? Define what that means to you and why it's important. What is it that you actually want, and what all does that involve? And who's involved with that situation? So let's use an example. And let's say, for example, that you have seen that there are more and more parks around the state that are developing accessible parks. And your park isn't there quite yet. And so you want to talk to somebody about making sure that your loved one who has some mobility issues or something along those lines is able to enjoy those playgrounds just like everybody else is. Well, why is that important to you? Well, it's important to you because you want to make sure that your loved one is actually included, that your loved one is able to enjoy the park and play just like every other kid can. And it's important because going to the park and being able to play with other kids is how you make sure that you're actually included in the community and that you can be a part of the community. And it's a way to help facilitate friendships for your kids. So, what do you want? You want to make sure that at least there's one park in your community that's accessible. So, what all does that involve? Well, maybe that's accessible playground equipment. Maybe that's making sure that there are more. I don't want to say sidewalks, but more paths that are stable, that are level, that somebody who uses a wheelchair or a walker or crutches may be able to use much easier than just mulch or rubber mulch. So think about what all does it involve to have an accessible playground, and then who's involved with that situation? Who is it that you actually need to talk to? Because that is the next most important thing is identifying who it is you actually need to talk to. There are several different levels of government, and knowing which level of government is the right one to talk to is key. So first we have the local level. That's the one that tends to affect our lives most often, but it's also the one that gets the least attention because it's the one that sounds and seems boring. But it's not. It's what actually touches our everyday lives. So when we're talking local government, we're going to be talking city councils or county commissioners. We're going to be talking about zoning ordinances, which I know makes you want to fall asleep, but is essential when it comes to things like accessible housing and accessible trails and all sorts of things like that. It's about city ordinances, but it's also about the parks and the libraries and all sorts of other things. So the things that actually affect your life on a day-to-day basis, whether it's potholes or sidewalks or bike paths, that's going to be at the local level, and that's who you want to talk to. When you're talking about the state government, that's going to be Medicaid and waivers. That's going to be education. That's going to be voting. That's going to be civil rights. So, a lot of different things at the state level that we have to deal with. Private insurance is one of those things that is regulated at the state level. Then we have the federal level, which is what tends to get the most attention. And that's where, yes, we're going to talk about Social Security at the federal level, Medicare and Medicaid at the federal level, civil rights at the federal level, education to a point at the federal level, funding for a lot of different programs, including everything from vocational rehabilitation services to Medicaid waivers to funding for accessible education in the school systems. So, a lot of different things that we do at the federal level, but at the same time, as much as that's what gets the attention, that's often not where you want to start. So once you figure out what level of government you need to engage with, identify who you need to talk with. Is this something that requires a legislative change? And if you're thinking, well, there's not really legislation at the local level, sure there is. That's exactly what a city or county ordinance is a legislative decision just at the local level. Is this something that just requires an administrative rule? Most, not all, but most Medicaid and Medicaid waiver regulations are actually done by administrative rule. And believe it or not, it's easier to get administrative rule changes than it is to get legislation passed. Or do you need to talk to, and I've written it as the fixer, because quite frankly, I wasn't sure how to really define this. Let's say one of the things you want to do is you want to see some sensory friendly programming at your local library or through your local parks department. Well, that's not a legislative change, and it's not even about administrative rules. Who you need to talk to is the head librarian or somebody in the parks department, whether it's the person who oversees youth activities through the parks or maybe the park director themselves. So sometimes you can talk to those local individuals who are able to make the decisions on their own without having to do an administrative rule change or a legislative change. And sometimes you have to talk to multiple people. And when that happens, you need to start at the foundation and build up. Let's say, for example, that, as we're talking about making an accessible park, one of the things we need to do is we need to make sure that there are accessible bathrooms. Well, let's say you've got an older child or an older loved one who is incontinent, and you need a changing table or a changing station for them, but one designed for toddlers is not going to do it. That's something that more often than not, people just haven't thought about. And so you start by talking to, the head, the person who's in charge of the park, start those conversations. You might then need to talk to the building inspectors to make sure that we've got the proper building codes in place to make it easier to have some of those more accessible features, or more accurately, to make sure that there's not some building code that could in some way impede having some of those more accessible features to it. So you may have to talk to multiple people, but you start from the foundation and you build up. You get people on your side and continue to grow with that idea to make sure that eventually you can get there. So once you identify who you need to talk to, research the person. Look at official websites, whether it's a campaign website, whether it's, the city or the town's website, maybe it's their job website. And by that, I mean, like, let's say they are a state legislature. You're looking at their legislative website to learn about them. Read those bios to learn about them. Check them out on Facebook. Identify the areas of interest that they have and identify their life experiences. What is their education? What's their occupation? What is their family like? Because you use that information to shape the message. Now, I know that sounds kind of stalkerish even to me as I say that, but I'm not saying do anything inappropriate. But when you learn, for example, that maybe you've got a city council member who is also a realtor, or who is a developer, you know, if there are certain building codes that you're looking for, or maybe you're wanting to make sure that your city doesn't give a lot of waivers on sidewalk construction because you want to make sure there are sidewalks available. Knowing that your city council member is also a realtor, you can talk with them about, how having sidewalks available makes a more walkable neighborhood and therefore increases property values. Maybe, and this is something I was recently at a town hall, and people were talking about, among other things, they were talking about accessible housing, the fact that we need more affordable, accessible housing, the fact that there are a lot of communities that are building a lot of 55 and older communities that are building more and more apartments and townhouses and homes for people 55 and older, as well as for people with disabilities. And one person in particular said, "We're building all of these places, but none of them have grab bars. So if you purchase a house or you rent an apartment in an apartment complex that's designed for people 55 and older, you still have to make modifications to make the home accessible. How does that make sense? If we're building it for people 55 and older, their needs are simply going to increase. Why aren't we requiring that they put grab bars in the bathrooms from the very beginning?" And I have to admit, it was kind of like, my brain exploded a little bit because what that person suggested was so simple and was so obvious, and yet not something that I ever even thought about. And sometimes that's really the thing. It's not that there's opposition necessarily. It's that sometimes people haven't thought about it because they don't live that life. And that's where we come in because we are the experts on disability related issues. And therefore, we need to use our experiences to help have some of these conversations. So reach out, send an email, make a phone call, explain to them, "Hey, I live in your district and I'd like to talk with you about accessible housing in our community. Can I make an appointment to come to your office or to meet with you somewhere to talk for coffee?" And start having those conversations. And especially right now, when you're doing all of this, you want to reach out not just to the current officials, but this is election season. You want to reach out to all the candidates to start having some of those conversations, and especially right now, and in right after the primary and in early summer, where where their schedules aren't completely filled yet. It's a great time to try to talk with candidates because, quite frankly, they want to talk to you because they want your vote. And they also want you to tell other people how great they are. So it might be a little bit easier to get some of those appointments and have some of those, meet some of those places for coffee to have some conversations because it's really about building a relationship. The most effective advocacy starts with building a relationship. This should not be a one-time thing. This should not be transactional either. You want to build that relationship before you start asking for help, because then you're building that familiarity, you're building that connection, and you're building a shared understanding of who you each are and where you're each coming from. That will also help you figure out how to shape your message to be the most effective. And when you're building that relationship, offer to be an information source for them. Because especially when we're talking about people with disabilities, at this point, everybody pretty much knows someone with a disability, but we all know that when you live it, you understand it in a completely different way. So we as the families and we as people with disabilities, we are the experts in this area. So we can share our experiences. We can explain to them how things happen in real life. You can talk about how, okay, that bathroom is technically an accessible bathroom. It meets all of the building codes. It's checking off all of the boxes. But if you're a wheelchair user, you really can't go into that bathroom and turn your wheelchair around, for example, to be able to functionally use it without leaving the door open. Nobody wants that. Or maybe it's about making them understand, hey, I'm a person who lives in your district. I have a son with a disability and he's on a Medicaid waiver. I want to tell you how this has really impacted our lives and how this has made my son's life better. I want to tell you how this supports him and what he's now able to do because of the supports and the services he's had. And sharing that personal story is what makes a huge difference because it humanizes the situation. It makes it relatable. It makes it more concrete because instead of just some vague thought or some abstract concept, you're putting it in real human terms. And that winds up making a big difference. When you're having those conversations, though, you want to keep it simple and you want to keep it short. I know we could all go on for a really long time. The joke in my office is that when somebody asks if I can talk about something for 20 minutes, my joke is I can talk about the color of the wall for 20 minutes. My problem is keeping it short. And many of you have been on my webinars, and you know that is one of my challenges. But in a situation like this, especially as you are developing that relationship, you want to keep it short. If you are sending an email to make that initial connection, if you send a 5-page email, they're not reading it. You want to keep it simple. You want to keep it to a page or two. If you're having an in-person meeting, keep it to 10, 15 minutes, something along those lines, where this is more of a get to know you kind of meeting, where you are giving the highlights. In the corporate world, they always say, give your elevator pitch. Well, this is your elevator pitch. I've got a 25-year-old son with autism. He's on something called the Family Supports Waiver. And here's what that means, because you need to also assume that they have no knowledge of the issues unless you know otherwise. If you know that that official has a child with Down syndrome, they get it. Because parents, we get these sorts of things. But if they don't have that direct connection, even if they've got a niece or a nephew, they'll understand things to a certain point, but because they don't live it, they don't fully understand all of it. So we need to help build this knowledge base from the ground up. And that also means building that relationship with that official from the ground up. And as you're talking to them, as you're giving them the highlights, you're giving them that elevator pitch of what the topic is and why it's important. Make sure you're leaving plenty of room for questions so that they can ask their questions and learn more. Because one of the realities is most officials, they want to learn more, especially elected officials. They're people. They like talking to people. They like making those connections. And so having it as a conversation and as a relaxed conversation where we're educating and getting to know each other more, you're going to get a better response. And as simple as this is, follow up initially with a thank you note. I know that sounds so old fashioned, but believe it or not, it makes a huge difference. So whether you are actually, sending them a physical note in the US mail, or you're just sending them an email thanking them for their time, it makes a big difference. And in that note or in that email, remind them about the things you spoke about. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me today, and thank you for listening about our experiences trying to go to the park as a child with a disability. Or thank you for talking to me today and hearing about our experiences with Medicaid waivers and what a difference they make in our lives. Remind them that you're here to be an information resource for them. You live in their district. This is important. This is important to you, and you are the expert. So let them know. Say, please feel free to reach out anytime you have questions about disabilities. I'd be happy to walk you through the issues and share our experiences with these things because this is what makes our community better. And then make sure you give them your contact information, whether it's your phone number, your email, your Facebook, whatever the case may be. Make sure they have ways to contact you so that when they do have questions, they can reach out. And you want to stay connected. Reach out periodically, not just once a year, not just when you need something, but reach out periodically just to, sometimes it could just be something to say, hey, I saw you in the newspaper and I saw that, you got, this award. I just wanted to say congratulations. You really deserve it. Or maybe it's, I saw this article in the news and it was talking about, this. I know we've talked about that in the past. It made me think of you. So I just wanted to reach out and say, hey, if you had any questions about this, I just wanted to remind you that I'm here for that. The other thing I'm going to say is go to public meetings. Do you know how many people go to city council meetings? Nobody. If you are constantly showing up or showing up at least on a regular basis, they're going to start recognizing you. And when they start recognizing you, they're going to start talking to you. So go to those public meetings. Introduce yourself to people. Hi, I'm Carly. I live over in X neighborhood, and I just wanted to come to the city council tonight to hear what else going on. Most of the time, city council meetings, county commission meetings, they are empty unless there is some big, huge, controversial thing. So if you're the one that they see on a regular basis, they're going to start talking to you on a regular basis and they're going to get to know you a little bit more. And as they do that, they're going to start asking your opinions more often. And maybe that's how you get a mayor's action council on disabilities started in your community. Maybe that's how you start getting, the accessible parks or more accessible restrooms in your area. Maybe that's how you get some of those building codes changed to make more accessible housing. Maybe that's how you get bike lanes, or you make sure that they don't give waivers for new buildings on sidewalks so that people can move around easier. Maybe that's also how you start meeting your state officials, your legislators. The Bureau of Disability Services um, tends to do public meetings. I know at one point they were doing them, I think every other month. They were called building bridges, and so going to those things means that you start building that familiarity. They start recognizing you. They say hi. They ask you questions. They learn a little bit more about you. And then you are the information resource as decisions are being made. And when you build those relationships with people, you can go to them and say, you know what? We're having a problem with this. How can we work together to improve this for our community? And that's how you start having those discussions and are able to make changes with those decision makers. And you want to make sure that you are staying engaged. And so I know that was fairly quick. Frankly, I don't think I've ever done an Ask the Arc this quickly before, but it's because it is one of those topics that some of the information is fairly universal. How you do this at the local level is very similar to how you're going to do it at the state level. The discussions and how you talk to people is going to be very similar, whether you're talking about, hey, you know what, I would love to see, is there any way that when we're doing our summer movie series in the park that we could have a sensory friendly movie night a few of those times, or maybe it's, you got some really, really great art programs through the park or through the library. Can we also make sure that we've got some sensory friendly things in here? Can we get some new programming in here that could be really engaging for people with disabilities and for all the other kids, and really also bring up that concept of universal design for living, which is what is essential for a person with a disability is just beneficial for everyone. My local library used to have automatic doors, and both doors would open automatically. It was very easy to get into. It was very accessible. And yes, that was essential for someone who is in a wheelchair, or someone who uses a walker, or who uses a cane, or who has some sort of mobility impairment. You know who else it was good for? Those moms who had strollers, especially those moms who had double strollers, those moms who were bringing in several young children, because it made it easier for them to get through. It's that concept of universal design and making sure that what is essential for a person with a disability is just good for all. And so at this point, I want to open it up. Please go ahead and put some questions in the Q&A, so that you can talk this through, and we can figure out and brainstorm together and kind of crowdsource some of the issues that we're dealing with, and some of the ways that have been more effective for people. So we've got a question here. What about petitions? If we're wanting to make change, are petitions effective? This is one of those times where I'm going to say I don't necessarily think they are, because anybody can sign a petition, and the same kind of goes for those copy and paste letters that people, that certain groups may send out, where that official is going to get 100 letters that say exactly the same thing, and the only thing that's different is the signature. Guess what? They tend to ignore those, because they know that you didn't really put any effort into it. All you did was sign your name. But when they get an email that you wrote, where it's obvious you are the one who actually wrote that email, they're not getting 100 of the exact same thing. Or if you actually write like a legit letter that goes through the US mail, people think that they have to send if they don't get thousands of letters, it's meaningless. No. You know what? Legislators kind of have a little bit of a panic attack when they get 3 actual US mail letters from people in their district, because that's seen as a landslide. Because if somebody's actually taking the time to write out a letter, how many people do that in this day and age? That makes a huge difference. So when it can be more personal, and email can be fine, don't get me wrong, but when it's more personal, when it's a letter you wrote, an email you wrote, a phone call you made, showing up and having a meeting. And it doesn't have to be, well, it definitely shouldn't be an hour. It doesn't have to be half an hour. Even 15 minutes can make a big difference. So doing things like that can have a huge effect. And don't get me wrong, sometimes rarely does something happen quickly. Normally, when something is happening very quickly, it's because we've had something catastrophic that has led up to it. Some of these things can take a while. I know I'm dating myself as I talk about this, but if any of you remember Schoolhouse Rock, and you remember I'm Just a Bill, where they talk about how a bill becomes a law, you know, some of the things that happen with that. Yes, sometimes we have something that is a great idea, and everybody agrees to it, and we can get it passed quickly. That's the anomaly. It often takes time, and that's okay, because as we take time, we're building more consensus, we're building more cooperation, we're building more approval, and that ultimately will make better change. So what other questions do we have? What ideas do you have? So you are welcome to go ahead and put questions in the Q&A. You'll see that little circled with the 3 dots down at the bottom that says more. That's where you will find the Q&A through that. What are some of the things that are most on your mind right now? What are the topics that are worrying you? I know that there have been a lot of changes with waivers, and that has a lot of people, that has a lot of people, uh, frankly confused because there have been so many changes. But also a lot of people want to make sure that as the state is making changes, that their voices are being heard in this. Next year, the state is planning on doing a wholesale redesign of waivers. They're calling it waiver reset, but it's building it all up from the foundation up. And they've got a dedicated email address exclusively so that people can submit their ideas and their comments about what they think waivers need to look like. I know that they were doing focus groups. They've held town halls. They've been really trying to engage people both in small groups as well as large groups to get input on how these things, on how waivers should be changed going forward. So, what are your thoughts on all of this? So you guys are really, really quiet tonight, and that is really uncommon. You guys are normally giving me all sorts of ideas and asking all sorts of questions. So please go ahead. You know, tell me what you're thinking. Okay. All right. Well, in that case, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. One of the things I want to share is that, you know, the oh, somebody is saying that she's got one need to put in. So go ahead and type your question or your thought in the Q&A. Let's talk about it. Um, so I'll give you a minute more so that you can type everything out. I have to admit I'm a very slow typist, and I have a lot of typos when I type. Um, but one of the things too is stay engaged with the ARC of Indiana. And I know that is a totally shameless plug here. I get that. But we're going to keep you up to date on what's going on at both the state and the national level. We're going to talk to you. We're going to engage to because especially when we are talking about Medicaid and when we quite frankly are trying to save Medicaid and trying to save waivers over the next few years as funding is becoming a bigger issue, as we are trying to make sure that students with disabilities are able to get an appropriate public education, as we are trying to make sure that people with disabilities are getting all of the things that they need. Um, we're going to want to talk with you. We're going to want to hear from you. We're going to want to make sure that you are talking to the right people to share your stories and to share your experiences in all of this. So, we want to keep you engaged. So, okay. So somebody else just wrote in. One of the new amendments in the Family Support and CIH waivers states that music and rec therapy cannot be used solely to transport individuals. Can you provide insight on what exactly this means? Does it mean if there's no meaningful therapy happening in the car that it's not billable time? And if there is therapy happening, is it reimbursable because it's therapy? That's really exactly what it is. Because one of the things that was happening before, and one of the things that actually led to the original 6 hour cap on music therapy and recreation therapy, is that sometimes people were going really, really far distances and like taking hours to drive somewhere and billing all of that as therapy time as opposed to billing it as transportation or even potentially billing it as PAC or residential services instead, and then billing it as therapy once they got to the location and were actually engaging in the therapy. So it's really more about making sure that hours that are being billed for therapy are actually therapeutic in nature. Sometimes you do have that in a car. Sometimes it's just transportation. And I'll give an example. So Like with my son, and this isn't an exact analogy here. Um, when my son does behavior support services, he and his behavior consultant are often driving around. But when they're driving around, they're talking, they're engaging, they are doing those therapeutic things. His behavior consultant has simply found that a lot of times doing that in a car, where it's a little bit more relaxed, and it's a little bit more in a natural setting, that oftentimes they can have better conversations, they can get more deeply engaged while driving around in a car listening to music or going somewhere, rather than sitting in the living room trying to engage that way. It kind of takes some of the pressure off. So they are doing therapy, it just happens to be in a car. When we're talking music therapy or rec therapy, are you doing therapy and it just happens to be that you're in a car doing it? Or is it that you are driving somewhere to start the therapy? If you're driving somewhere to start the therapy, we just have to bill it a different way. Rather than billing it as therapy. And I think that's one of the reasons that's one of the things that wound up causing some of the concerns that developed last year. Um, so this person also asked, I noticed that in the ARC's recent public comment that they advocated for 8 hours of music and rec therapy, increasing the cap. Can I speak to this? So by the way, the ARC of Indiana always submits public comment, whether it's for waivers, whether it was for the ABA changes that were recently out for public comment. The state recently had WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, the WIOA Unified State Plan, out for public comment. First Steps is out for public comment now. We don't have those comments written yet. The ARC weighs in on all of these issues, and we always make sure that we publicize what our public comments are, so you can see what the ARC's position is, and you can see what we're advocating for. One of the reasons that we were advocating, for 8 hours of music and rec therapy a month is simply, logistics. One of the things, we recognize the state is wanting to have a cap on these services because there were some bad actors who, and unfortunately, it was a small number of bad actors who were really overbilling and were really billing for therapy services when they weren't actually providing therapy. And as a result, that wound up costing quite a bit of money. And so as a result, the state decided to put in those universal caps. But I also recognize that 6 hours a month, that's maybe an hour and a half a week. That's really difficult to do therapy. So it made sense of, if you want to make a cap, then let's make it a reasonable cap. Let's make it at least 2 hours a week, so that the person can actually get some real therapeutic benefit for it. So that was what was behind. That's what was behind our public comment, was to recognize where the state was coming from, and recognizing that they had that goal, but let's make it more reasonable. Let's make it about what people need. And that's one of the other things is, the reality is, right now we are in some uncertain economic times. We know that Congress, at the federal level, has passed a $1 trillion cut to Medicaid services over the course of the next decade. And the issue is, waiver services are not something that's actually required. So waiver services are one of those things that are most in danger of being cut and being reduced, because states get to choose if they want to provide waiver services and how much they are willing to spend on waiver services. And so we need to be mindful about using what it is that we actually need, so that, as opposed to just what's available to us, because we've also got a waiting list that is growing. And, I'm part of that generation where my son was in that 10 to 15 year waiting period. I don't want anyone to ever have to do that again. At one point, we got our waiting list down for the family supports waiver to only 6 months. I would love to get back there. I would love to get to the point where we don't have waiting lists. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that we're being reasonable in how we're using our waivers and making sure that we're using what we need, what we truly need, and not just trying to use every dollar because it's there and because we're afraid we're going to lose it if we don't. So that's one of those things too that we've got to keep in mind, is because if we are using what we need, then that frees up more dollars so that more people can come off those waiting lists and more kids and more individuals are able to get what it is that they need in addition. But we're also, as the ARC, we're also looking at all sorts of different options and different plans to figure out, ways that make sense and where we are good stewards of Medicaid dollars and waiver dollars, that we are making sure that there isn't fraud, because there has been fraud. Not a ton, not nearly as much as people think, but there have been some bad actors, and as a result, now we're all kind of paying for that. So we want to make sure that we are reducing, waste and fraud and abuse. But something like music therapy or rec therapy, that's not waste. People benefit from those things. Making sure that people, can work with their behaviors, that's not waste. That is something that has tangible benefit. Making sure that we are using what we need so that it's there, and then making sure that in using what we need, hopefully it can free up dollars so that other individuals can also get what they need. I'm having an issue with a request for skilled nursing being sent in, but denied due to missing documentation. There's more to this question, but I want to stop here. That is one of the huge things that the state is cracking down on right now. And in fact, the I think it was the Health and Human Services Inspector General just issued a report on Indiana back in, I believe it was December. I'm pulling that all off the top of my head, so I can't swear that that is all accurate. But one of the big issues that that Health and Human Services at the federal level, and the Inspector General's report specifically was documenting, was that Indiana Medicaid was paying out a lot of claims without the appropriate documentation, without having appropriate documents, with missing documents, with documents that didn't support the service that was being billed. So one of the things we are going to see is that the state is absolutely going to crack down a lot more on documentation. And that's something that your provider agency, whether it's a medical provider like a home health agency, or whether it's a medical provider like a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, an ABA therapist, they really, really, really need to beef up their documentation, what exactly the individual's need is, what the treatment plan is going to be, why that treatment plan is appropriate, why the number of requested hours or the requested amount of service is appropriate, and why something less would not be appropriate. So we're going to see a lot more issues on documentation. And so if you are already having this problem, make sure you're talking to whatever provider that is, whether it's a medical provider, whether it's a waiver provider, and making sure they know, hey, I've been told this is something the state is really cracking down on. So we've got to get a whole lot more detail than we've ever had to be in the past to make sure services are getting approved. I literally stopped after the first sentence of her question, so let me go back to it. They've asked for an administrative review, which gave us back 2 days for school only, which leaves ABA unstaffed the other 3 days a week. My adult child has a lot of diagnoses that aren't all visible, but are there. I'm being refused the requests that were used by the nursing company, so I'm able to appeal this myself. What do you recommend? So, especially because you mentioned ABA and you mentioned that your child is actually an adult, one of the things is that the state is saying that they are only going to provide ABA services to individuals 20 and younger. That was something that we also put in our public comment, was that for some adults, ABA is the only behavioral or mental health therapy that they can actually engage in. And so for some adults, that is their only option. And so we need to be able to make exceptions so that if this is the only feasible or the only therapeutic intervention somebody can engage in, that we are taking that into consideration and making sure that that is available for them. I think the biggest piece of advice right now that I can recommend is really documenting why those other 3 days a week were needed. Um, and now, especially if you haven't had those things for a while, what are the impacts of the cut? If for example, and I'm totally making things up here and I'm changing the parameters just a little bit. Let's say we had somebody who was approved for 8 hours of home health services, a day, 5 days a week, and now suddenly we've cut it down to two. Well, why do they need 8 hours? Why does it have to be 8 hours? Is it because, hey, is it because, it's there as a precaution? That's something the state's really going to cut down on. Is it that, oh, well, they might need some help? That's where they're going to be cutting. But if you can say, hey, this person needs medication, at these times throughout the day and cannot take them on their own. They have to take meals through their G2 and they have to do that at these times. Um, and it takes X amount of time to actually complete that entire process from preparation to providing the meal to cleaning up after the meal. And it would be unreasonable to do that in a 3-hour period because who eats all of their meals or takes all of their medication in a 3-hour period? But really talking about those things, and really documenting the amount of time that it reasonably takes to do certain tasks. And also, if there has been a cut and there has been harm as a result of that, really documenting those things. As a result of not having, appropriate home health care, we have, he's increased the how often he is seeing the doctor because we're having these side effects because we're not getting the care in the manner in which they need. I'm totally making that up because I'm also trying not to be too specific there. But that's how I would deal with something like that. Um, okay. Um, as a result, instead of the bad actors, why doesn't the state mandate EVV for? I'm not 100% sure what that acronym is. It's RETH, which recreation therapy. That's what it is. Sorry. Um, with a uniform EMR system everyone uses. Okay. So I agree with you. We need, yes, we need to have reasonable regulations in place. And yes, we need to make sure that bad actors aren't able to overbill. And we need to have some of that in place. Should we have more targeted regulations that are actually addressing the problem as opposed to sweeping changes? Yeah, we should. Should we be punishing everyone for a few people who were acting inappropriately? No, we shouldn't be punishing everyone for that. And so I think right now, one of the things is that the pendulum has swung so far because of the costs that came with this. So now we've got to get it back into that reasonable middle level. And part of that is going to be talking to people and sharing our stories and talking about how some of these massive cuts and massive changes are actually affecting our daily lives. So I think that, I think anytime that something massive happens, sometimes people just by nature will overcompensate, and I kind of think that's part of what's happening right now is that the state is trying to put in super restrictive measures. I think we need to get that back to the middle and get that back to moderation and being reasonable, making sure we've got responsible regulations to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse, but getting it back to that middle ground. That is my opinion on that, at least. Um, okay. I'm having issues with leaders and elders in our church. My daughter has high functioning autism and sometimes makes poor decisions and posts things on Facebook. And she has a sleep disorder and sometimes has trouble going to church. Um, let's see, it's causing a huge problem. And I've attempted to educate, but they just don't get it. Um, so I don't really want to leave this church, but I need some resources to give them to educate them if I can ever get them to listen at all. This is really stressing me out. I need help, please, and thank you. You know what? This happens more often than we ever really talk about. And this is one of those times where I'm going to say, yes, we need to educate the church. We also need to educate our loved ones in this because we've also got to we have to teach them, what's appropriate. And yes, you have freedom of speech. And yes, you are absolutely entitled to your opinions, but sometimes there are consequences to those opinions too. And so, as we are doing things, we also need to be polite about it. And sometimes we forget that part, especially. Let me rephrase that. I know sometimes I forget that part, especially when I'm really mad. And sometimes I may go off a little bit, but then I remember I need to rein myself back in and be more diplomatic and be more polite, especially if I want to actually make things better, especially if I want to change. When I talk to families about different things, especially, like if they're having problems with Medicaid or something like that, or they're having problems with Social Security and they're really frustrated, which is totally understandable. One of the things I always tell them though is be overly nice to the people at Medicaid and to the people at Social Security because they get yelled at all day, every day. And if you are the one person who is really nice to them, they are going to try to help you out more. They are going to be nicer to you back because you were the one person who didn't yell at them. So in a situation like this, I completely understand where you're coming from. Yes, we've got to educate them and help them understand that some of this is we also need to educate our loved ones about the fact that yeah, there can be consequences. And if you yell at your boss, you are likely going to get fired. If you constantly complain about something, they may ask you not to come back because that is also a real life consequence in this world. But we also need to help the other side understand if we can, and especially since we're talking about a church, asking for their patience, asking for grace, especially as you are trying to help your daughter understand what's appropriate and what isn't. And then also for her, if she's frustrated, if she's angry about something, helping her figure out, okay, you're really angry about this. How can we address this? What are the best ways to address this? If you're really mad um, that they're doing X, Y, and Z, how can we talk to them so that they can change their minds about doing X, Y, and Z? Or how can we convince them to make some alterations so that X is easier to address? So don't get me wrong, I completely understand where you're coming from. This is one of those times where we've got to also look at both sides and recognize that sometimes what we also need to do, in addition to trying to educate others about our loved ones with disabilities and what their needs are, part of that is also educating our loved ones about how people see them and how certain things come across, even if that's not what they meant to do, so that we can actually try to find some common ground there. Um, oh my goodness. Somebody's saying, I'm new to the family support waiver. Is there a way to use it differently than just respite hours? Oh my gosh, on the family support waiver, there are literally about 30 different services that are available. And so what I would start with is I would start by thinking, okay, what is it that I want for my loved one? I'll give you an example. So when my son started waiver services, he was young. I can't remember if he was middle school or early high school, to be perfectly honest with you. He was around then. And I remember talking to my case manager at the time, in our intake appointment, and she's like, "Okay, well, what are you wanting this waiver to do? What do you want to get out of this?" And I said, "I want him to have social skills." She looked at me, and part of it was she was a friend who I'd known for 10 years. Our kids were in mothers of preschoolers together. But she looked at me and she goes, "No, you want him to have friends." And I just kind of stopped and I kind of melted. I'm like, "Yeah, that's exactly what I want." She's like, "Okay, here are some services that can help him with that." And so that's, first of all, that's one of the things a good case manager will do is they won't rely on you to know what services you want, because for the most part, the only thing anybody's ever heard of is respite. um, they will ask, "What is it that you want to get out of this?" And they'll brainstorm different ways and different services that could be available to actually help them achieve those things. In our case, one of the things that our case manager recommended at the time, there was a service called community habilitation. It's now been merged with facility habilitation and renamed day habilitation, because, any normal human being is going to know what day habilitation even is. Um, but there was a service provider in our area who would put together small groups of people, um, and in our case, they were all teens and tweens on the autism spectrum. They all lived in roughly the same area, and they would try to find people who could get along well, or who they thought would get along well, and they would do all sorts of things. They would go out and they would play basketball, or they'd play various games. Once or twice a month, they'd do a paid activity. And so technically, they were working on skills like, how to leave a tip at a restaurant and all that. But they were also, in my son's case, they were working on conversation skills, because that's something my son struggled with. They were working on those social skills. They were working on self advocacy skills, because the boys would decide each month what they wanted to do, and then they were also learning, how to accept decisions that they didn't like. So if all the boys wanted to do something that they didn't like, basically how to suck it up, because that is a life skill too. And so those were some things. So really, a good case manager should be talking to you, what are the things you want to get out of this? And that's going to vary by age. If your child is 7, 8, 9 years old, what you're wanting for them is going to be different than what you would want if they were 15, or what you would want if they were 25, or what you would want if they were 55. So part of it is really starting from there. What is it that you want to get out of this? What is your vision of a good life for your loved one? What is their vision of a good life for themselves? That's something that you will hear from something called the life course framework, but that's a great way to start having those conversations. And then, instead of revolving our lives to fit whatever services are out there, figuring out what services fit our lives and fit our goals and our outcomes. So, and then, sorry, I just said the word outcome, and that just triggered a new thought, which is one of the things the state is going to be focusing on a whole lot more, whether it's waiver services, whether it's Medicaid health services, whether it's, education. They're going to be focusing a whole lot more on outcomes, on measurable outcomes. So keep some of those things in mind as you are making choices and you are making decisions and you are trying to engage with different services. What are the ultimate outcomes that you're looking for? How do we define whether or not this is successful and whether or not this is working? So I just wanted to kind of give you that heads up too. Um, So let's see. I know that there are also a lot of people who are concerned that with limits on rec therapy, with limits on music therapy, with limits on behavior support services, there are a lot of people who are concerned about losing their therapists. I don't know if that's something you need to worry about, and it's not that I'm dismissing it. What I'm thinking is, one of the issues with especially music and rec therapy is that oftentimes, not in all cases, but there were a lot of provider agencies who had big wait lists to get a rec therapist or a behavior or a music therapist. And so I think part of the thought process to the state also was that if we limit the number of hours an individual can have per month for these services, that would then free up that therapist to bring in additional clients and be able to serve more people that way. Um, like I said, I think limits need to be reasonable, and I think that we need to make sure that these services with those caps are actually usable, and provide enough time to be able to use them. But I think that was also part of their decision, or part of their thought process as they were making that decision. Um, let's see. So okay. Okay, the person who had the concern earlier about nursing services being denied, they're asking, how do I obtain the request if the nursing company is refusing to get it? Um, it's a really good question. If it's actually home health services and not a waiver service, if it were a waiver service instead, that could be something that your case manager may be able to get. If it is a Medicaid health coverage situation, you should have gotten a copy of the denial. And in that denial letter, it should have a section on what to do if you disagree with this decision. And it should give you either an email or a phone number to contact. I mean, it's also telling you about how to appeal and things like that. But you can also reach out to that phone number or to that email to request a copy of the initial request so that you can review it to see what maybe was missing. And that's how I would say it to them is I'd like to see a copy of the orders that were submitted so I can see what information may be missing, that would help show the need for this, for these hours or something along those lines. But you may be able to get it that way is by contacting whoever is actually listed under the if you disagree with this decision section so that you can find that. And I'm really, really grateful that that was your thought is, how can I get that request? Because that's really where things begin. So we've got to get it back down to those foundational levels and build from the top up or build from the bottom up, and getting that initial request is the perfect way to do that, to figure out, is all of the information in there accurate? Is there information missing? And then build from there. Um, so okay. Um, so let me know what other so the person who was asking the question about the church, I recognize the person. I will call you tomorrow, my dear, so that we can kind of or next week, whatever works better for you, so that we can talk about this a little bit more in depth, and specific to your situation, so that we can have a more robust conversation. But because this is more of a webinar, I don't want to get too personal, just because I want to respect people's privacy. What other questions do you guys have, or thoughts do you guys have in all of this? Gonna give people a moment to try to type if they can. So, because someone just did. Oh, so what other thoughts do you have? What other ideas do you have? Like I said, it was last week I was in a town hall where somebody brought up the why don't we require grab bars in the shower of 55 and older communities, and really, I'm not joking. It was like fireworks going off in my brain. And people have really great ideas. What are your great ideas? So keep thinking about it. Keep thinking about what you want in your loved one's life, what you need in your life. How do we make sure that our loved ones are cared for and that they get the supports they need, but that they're also able to get out and be active and live their lives just like everybody else is? How do we make sure those things happen? What are the things that are important to us about that? And how do we try to either develop new resources, to maybe rearrange some of the resources that we already have? Maybe we expand other resources. How do we make sure some of those things happen? So think about that for a while. Um, so I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I hope this was helpful. I hope it inspired you to reach out to the officials in your community, whether it's a local official over a situation in your local community, whether it is your state legislators, and you want to reach out to them on a variety of different topics. Um, I hope this has inspired you. And I know sometimes this can be intimidating. It really can be. Here's the thing though, all of those people, they want your support. So it feels intimidating. This is one of those times where I'm going to tell you, put on that smile, beef up your confidence, fake it till you make it. You don't have to be confident on the inside. Just project that on the outside. That makes life a whole lot easier, and helps you get through it. But here's the thing, calling a state legislator and asking to meet with them may feel intimidating. They desperately want to talk to you, especially right now because it's election season. Find out who they're running against. Talk with them too. Disability is not a partisan issue. Disability is a universal issue. And so it affects everyone. So go ahead, make sure that give yourself the confidence and the grace and the permission to reach out. Especially once you do it the first time, it starts getting a whole lot easier because you realize that these individuals, they're just people. They're people like everybody else. Sometimes they spill their coffee and just like everybody else does. So make sure you're talking to them because that is what is going to make the biggest difference in our state and in our communities. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. We will be back next month for Ask the Arc, and we will see you then. Have a great night. Bye bye.